The most sacred night of the year, Christmas Eve. As the whole family gathered around the festive table, the man I had loved with all my youth picked up a leather belt, approached me, and screamed at me to kneel and confess my sin of adultery. The whistle of the belt through the cold air was like a blade, slicing through all grace and justice. I didn't cry or beg. I simply, silently pulled out a USB flash drive and plugged it into the large TV in the living room. With the sound of fireworks in the background, the house fell into a deathly silence as the screen lit up with my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law, my husband's sister's husband, tangled in a shameful embrace. How did I, the daughter-in-law, who had always been submissive and obedient, reach this dead end? And how did I get this shocking video? The night before Christmas Eve, the weather was cold, but people's hearts were warm. My husband's 3-story colonial house was more lively than ever. The aroma of roast turkey wafting from the kitchen filled the space, mingling with the savory smell of the gravy my mother-in-law was preparing. Carol had just set down the pot, and the laughter of aunts and uncles, along with the sound of children running through the yard, created a scene of harmony anyone would envy. I, Sarah, for the past 5 years had been bustling in the kitchen. As my hands quickly arranged the platter of turkey, my eyes drifted to the living room where my husband, Michael, was chatting with his uncles. His sturdy figure in a new shirt and his kind smile still made my heart beat as hard as it did when I first met him. I had always thought that as long as he was here, as long as this family was at peace, all my suffering and patience would be worth it. Until tonight, for the last 5 years, I had been deceiving myself. The Christmas Eve dinner, at least on the surface, unfolded in a cordial atmosphere. Carol, my mother-in-law, a sharp-tongued and authoritarian woman who considered her words the law of the house, seemed kinder than usual today. She served me a piece of turkey and said to everyone, "Our Sarah is so good and hardworking. Since she became my daughter-in-law, you have no idea how much work she's taken off my shoulders." I could only lower my head and smile, a programmed smile perfected after years of learning to please others. I knew it was just an empty compliment. Barely a week ago, she had harshly berated me in public at the grocery store for buying vegetables that were slightly wilted, calling me blind and useless, a disgrace to the family name. My husband's sister, Laura, was a beautiful woman, but with a perpetually melancholic expression. Beside her was her husband, Mark, an extroverted and eloquent man who always knew how to please my mother-in-law. He was the ideal son-in-law Carol always praised in comparison to Michael, whom she considered too soft and unambitious. Everything would have continued to flow within that false peace if not for the sound of a text notification on my phone. I had left it on the table while washing dishes. The message was from my boss, Mr. Henderson, an older superior who always helped me professionally. It was a normal, polite Christmas greeting. "Sarah, wishing you and your family a Merry Christmas and all the best." A completely harmless message, but that message was seen by Michael, and it became the spark that lit the fuse of a tragedy that had been smoldering in secret for a long time. Michael picked up my phone and his face hardened. The kind smile from before vanished, replaced by a cold, strange expression I had never seen. Without asking me a word, he walked silently to the living room where everyone was watching a Christmas special. Just as the clock struck midnight on the sacred Christmas midnight, when everyone stood up to toast, Michael spoke suddenly. His voice broke the solemnity of the room. "One moment, everyone. I have something to say." Everyone looked at him, perplexed. Michael walked to the center of the living room and held up my phone. "Sarah, come here for a moment." A bad feeling made my heart race. As soon as I stepped forward, before I could ask what was wrong, he threw the phone on the coffee table. "Explain yourself. Who is this bastard texting you at this hour? You've been cheating on me behind my back." The whole house froze, and I was speechless. His accusation was like a bucket of ice water in the middle of winter. I stammered. "What are you talking about? It's my boss. He just sent me a Christmas greeting." But my explanation was too weak against his already ignited rage. Carol immediately stepped in. Her gaze was as sharp as a knife, and her voice was cutting, as if she had found the perfect opportunity to humiliate me. What kind of boss sends a message to another man's wife on Christmas Eve? I knew from your face you couldn't be trusted. You're the kind of woman who, even when married, goes around with other men. My sister-in-law Laura added with a voice full of sarcasm. Mother, don't be surprised. She's pretty. It's normal for her to have men chasing her. Poor my brother Michael. I felt the world spin. Why? Why could they accuse me so brazenly? I looked at Michael with pleading eyes. Honey, you know me. I'm not like that. But Michael didn't look at me. He turned his head and stared at a wall. And then he did something I will never forget. He walked to a corner of the room. There hung an old leather belt that, according to family lore, his grandfather had left behind to discipline his descendants. He took it down. The sound of the creaking leather was chillingly dry. Kneel, he said through clenched teeth. His eyes were bloodshot. Kneel before our ancestors, before the whole family, and confess your sin. Tell me, how many times have you slept with him? I took a step back in horror. My whole body trembled. No, this is not my husband. This man in front of me is not Michael. He is not the man who promised to protect me for life. He is a demon. I shook my head and tears began to well up. I've done nothing wrong. Please don't do this. Still making excuses? Michael shouted. He brandished the belt, and the whistle of the air tore at my ears. No one in the family intervened. My mother-in-law stood with her arms crossed, a satisfied smile on her face. The relatives were scared, curious, or had simply made me the star of their macabre theater. Just before the belt fell, at the moment I thought I would die, beaten and humiliated on this Christmas night. All the love, all the patience, all the faint hope of the last 5 years shattered into dust. My heart no longer hurt. It had grown so cold it had turned into a sharp piece of ice. I was no longer the lamb awaiting slaughter. No, tonight I was going to show them that when you corner a sheep, it can also become a wolf. I no longer retreated. I stood tall and looked Michael directly in the eyes. My hands slowly slipped into my coat pocket. There, I hid something far more fearsome than his belt. A small USB drive containing a truth capable of burning down this family's entire false honor. And as I walked toward the television, I knew it was I who was about to turn this game around. If this story has piqued your empathy and curiosity, don't forget to like it. And when the first image appeared on the screen, I knew this Christmas night would not only be about fireworks, but also the night a respectable family would crumble in disgrace. What happened in the following minutes? Everyone in the room held their breath with each of my steps. The belt in Michael's hand stopped midair, frozen like an ugly statue, a symbol of violence and cruelty. All eyes, previously filled with surprise, contempt, and morbid pleasure, were now focused on me. A small figure swimming against the current of a flood that threatened to swallow me. Perhaps they thought I had gone mad. A woman accused of adultery by her husband on Christmas Eve, surrounded by the entire family, instead of kneeling, crying, and begging, was calmly walking towards the television. Carol twisted her lips slightly. A disdainful smile was clearly drawn on her well-made-up face. What new trick are you going to pull now? Who is this show for? Or are you going to play a sad song to beg for pity? Her mocking voice broke the tense silence and echoed in the room. My brother-in-law, Mark, always pretending to be the model son-in-law, also let out a hypocritical sigh. Sister-in-law, if you've done something wrong, just admit it. The most important thing for a woman is to protect the honor of her husband's family. If you make this a bigger deal, you'll only hurt yourself. His words, seemingly sincere advice, were actually another blade rubbing salt in my wound, implicitly confirming that I was the guilty one and should endure this humiliation in silence. I didn't answer. My hand didn't tremble at all as I inserted the USB drive into the side port of the large television. I had been preparing for this moment for a long time, not with cunning, but with tears and humiliation. The remote control was on the table. I picked it up and gently ran my fingers over the buttons. The light from the screen illuminated my face. I guess at that moment, my expression was terrifyingly calm. I had been a clumsy actress for too long in the play called Happy Family. I had memorized the role of the sensible daughter-in-law, the competent wife, the person who knew her place. I played that role so perfectly that I almost forgot who I was, that I also had feelings, felt pain, and had dignity. But tonight, that role was over. The director of this play was me, and all of them, one by one, would have to play their true roles without masks. I turned my head and scanned the room. My eyes stopped on the man I once loved more than my own life, Michael. He was still there, the belt in his hand trembling slightly. The initial anger on his face was now mixed with a bit of bewilderment and confusion. He probably didn't understand why I could be so calm, why I wasn't screaming or begging as he and his family expected. "Sarah, what are you doing? Don't make things worse. Make things worse." I smiled faintly, a smile without warmth, a smile where despair had solidified like a stone. "Do you think anything could be worse than this, honey? Is there anything worse than being humiliated, falsely accused, and nearly beaten by your beloved husband in front of the whole family on Christmas Eve? Tell me, is there anything worse than this?" My voice wasn't loud, but each word pierced the silence of the room like a needle piercing through his cowardice. I stared into his eyes, trying to find some trace of the old Michael, of the man who promised to protect me. But all I saw was emptiness and fear. Michael lowered his head. He couldn't answer because he knew I was right. Seeing her son cornered, my mother-in-law shouted sharply. Her voice grated on my eardrums like a razor blade. "What right do you have? You've stained this family's honor with your adultery, so it's normal for you to be hit." "Michael, hit her already, son. Beat that shameless woman into shape," she urged, as if she wanted to see me tortured immediately, as if my pain were her pleasure. But it was too late. Her words now only served to make the play I was about to screen more dramatic. Without another word, I turned around. My finger gently pressed the play button, and the television screen lit up. But what appeared was not a sad music video or a plea for sympathy. What was revealed in the crisp, full HD quality of the expensive television was a familiar setting, the living room of this very house. The shiny leather sofa and the large hunting scene painting that my mother-in-law was so proud of were visible. And the two protagonists were performing a play 1,000 times more disgusting than the false accusation they had just thrown at me. The woman in the video had her hair up in a high bun and a familiar figure. It was none other than my mother-in-law, Carol, and the man embracing her, caressing her back incessantly, was my brother-in-law, Mark, Laura's husband. That scene, that shameful and clandestine act of affection was projected vividly, uncensored in front of the entire family. The sound of people breathing seemed to stop. The noise of the fireworks outside suddenly felt awkward and distant. The whole world seemed to shrink to a deathly silence, and the raw, ugly images dancing on the large screen. The belt fell from Michael's hand to the floor. A dry, pitiful sound. A thwack that sounded as if the honor of an entire family was shattering. A whole respectable family was forced to witness an unbelievable truth. But how did I get this terrifying video? And what was the reaction of each family member when their true faces were unmasked on Christmas night? It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Time seemed to have stopped the instant those repulsive images appeared, revealing a raw and sick truth that no one could have imagined. The murmurs ceased. The children's laughter died down. Only a heavy, sticky silence enveloped everyone. The complexion of every face turned from astonishment and confusion to absolute disgust. The uncles and aunts, who had always prided themselves on the family's morality, now sat with their mouths agape, their eyes fixed on the screen as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Carol, my mother-in-law, who just minutes before had been arrogantly preaching morality and screaming for me to be beaten, was now frozen in place. Her eyes were fixed on her own image on the TV, her face as white as paper. Not even her elaborate makeup could hide the panic and humiliation that washed over her. Her lips moved, but not a single word came out. She staggered and barely managed to grab the arm of the sofa to stay upright. Her whole body trembled like a leaf. Beside her, my brother-in-law Mark, the man who always behaved so refined and courteous, was not much better. His face was ashen, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. He stammered in a pathetic, trembling voice. This is fake. It's photoshopped." But his words were powerless against the vivid and realistic images unfolding before their eyes. Anyone could see it wasn't fake. It was the truth. A raw, disgusting truth. Perhaps the most shocked of all was my sister-in-law, Laura. She stood motionless. Her beautiful but always sad eyes were now filled with panic, and a heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She stared at the man she had always trusted, the man for whom she had dedicated her youth to building a home. Then she looked at her mother, whom she deeply respected. The two most important people in her life were betraying her in the most painful and humiliating way possible. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, without sobs, just a heartbreaking silence. Slowly, she turned her head towards me. In her eyes, there was no longer sarcasm or contempt, but a complex, indescribable look. There was resentment towards me for revealing this cruel truth, but also a glimpse of gratitude for freeing her from a deception. And my husband, Michael, collapsed into the nearest chair as if all strength had left his body. He looked at the screen, then at me. His eyes were filled with incomprehensible confusion. He probably couldn't believe that his mother, whom he had always idolized, and who had incited him to blame and mistreat his wife, was starring in the most repugnant of infidelity dramas. The faith and respect he had held for her for years had completely crumbled in a matter of minutes. Amid the eerie silence, the only person who remained composed was me. I picked up the remote and calmly pressed the pause button, freezing the most humiliating moment of my mother-in-law and brother-in-law on the screen. Then I turned and looked directly at each person in the room. My voice wasn't loud, but it resonated clearly and firmly, like a hammer striking their consciences. What's wrong? Is everyone very surprised? My respected mother-in-law, my esteemed brother-in-law, does this video look familiar? Would you like me to play some more? I still have many from different angles, recordings from a whole week, and I also have the original unedited audio. My words were like a second bomb exploding in the room. Carol finally reacted. She let out a demented scream, a mixture of rage and extreme fear. "You crazy bitch! How dare you put hidden cameras in our house? Michael, what are you doing just standing there? Smash that TV and kill her." She lunged at me like a wounded beast, her hands raised to scratch me. But this time, Michael no longer obeyed her. He sat there motionless, his gaze lost in the void. My brother-in-law, Mark, rushed to intervene, not to protect his mother-in-law, but to snatch the USB drive from the television. "Give me that! Give it to me!" he shouted as if he wanted to destroy the evidence, but I was quicker. I pulled out the USB drive and clutched it in my palm. "Want it back?" "It won't be easy, brother-in-law. And don't forget, I've saved copies of the original in several places. If anything were to happen to me, or if I simply felt like it tomorrow, the whole city could enjoy the wonderful performance of you and your mother-in-law." My threat had an immediate effect. Mark stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale and bloodless. He knew I wasn't joking. He knew that his career, his reputation, his family, everything he had worked so hard to build was in my hands. Just a few minutes earlier, the whole family was on the high ground of judgment. and now they had fallen into the abyss of humiliation. The play was over, but their tragedy had only just begun. But how could a daughter-in-law like me obtain such a momentous video? It was no coincidence. It was the result of 5 years of pain and suspicion that burned secretly throughout my married life. The biggest question on everyone's mind right now, the question I could read in their horrified eyes, was why? How could I, the seemingly harmless daughter-in-law who always bowed her head in silence, hold such a terrible secret in my hands? They probably thought I was a cunning person who had been digging a trap and planning my revenge for a long time, waiting for the day to strike. But they were wrong. I wasn't the hunter. I was just the prey who, after being chased for too long, learned to fight back. This wasn't a truth I sought. It was a truth they themselves forced me to confront. It all started about a year ago with small signs, scattered pieces of a puzzle that were initially so unimaginable and contrary to morality that even I couldn't connect them. I began to notice something strange in the relationship between my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law, Mark. At first, I thought it was just Carol's special affection for a competent, witty son-in-law who always pleased her. She always praised Mark, his eloquence, his way of handling life, even the way he chose the fruit he gifted. Whenever Mark came over, she would go to the kitchen herself to prepare his favorite dishes. This attitude was markedly different from the sullen expression she usually showed me and Michael. It made me feel a little bad, but I told myself it was normal. My husband, Michael, was gentle, honest, and a bit slow, not as sharp and eloquent as his brother-in-law, so it was understandable that my mother-in-law favored her son-in-law. I tried to console myself with these thoughts and overcome the vague feeling of discomfort. But that affection gradually became stranger, crossing the boundaries of a normal mother-in-law and son-in-law relationship. I started to notice the glances they exchanged, furtive, meaningful looks, touches that seemed casual but lasted strangely long. Once while I was in the kitchen, I casually glanced into the living room through the crack in the door. My mother-in-law was sitting on the sofa, and Mark was on the floor, his head resting on her lap as she stroked his hair. It was a very intimate scene, far from a normal relationship between a mother-in-law and son-in-law. I felt something was wrong. My throat went dry, but once again I blamed myself for being too sensitive and overthinking. Maybe some families expressed affection so closely. I struggled to find reasons to defend them and reassure myself. My suspicions were truly confirmed when my sister-in-law, Laura, went on a business trip to Chicago for a week. During that week, Mark came to our house for dinner almost every day. The excuse was that he felt lonely at home and enjoyed eating with his mother-in-law. My mother-in-law couldn't hide her joy. She cooked banquets and cared for him more attentively than her own son. Every night they would talk in the living room until very late. Their laughter reached my bedroom. One night, I went down to the kitchen for water. It was midnight, and I froze when I saw that the door to my mother-in-law's room was slightly ajar, and inside, I glimpsed the shadows of 2 people. At that moment, I felt my heart stop. I ran back to my room, my mind filled with horror and disgust. I should tell Michael, but I knew he would never believe me. He would think I was making up stories out of jealousy to hurt his mother. He would say again that I was overthinking, that I was too sensitive. The climax of my suspicions came on my mother-in-law's birthday. Michael and I got her an expensive silk scarf as a gift, but when we gave it to her, she accepted it with indifference, thanked us perfunctorily, and set it aside. When it was Mark's turn, he gave her a jade bracelet. Carol was so happy she hugged him, put the bracelet on her wrist, and caressed it all night. That night, after all the guests had left, I happened to pass by my mother-in-law's room. The door wasn't completely closed. I heard her talking on the phone with someone. Her voice was incredibly flirtatious and sweet. "Thank you for the gift. I love it. I wish you were here tonight." I was paralyzed. That voice was clearly that of someone talking to a man. But who was that man? It couldn't be. A terrible thought crossed my mind, and I got goosebumps. From that moment, I knew I couldn't remain silent. I wasn't doing it for revenge. I needed the truth, an explanation for everything that was happening in that house. I needed a talisman to protect myself from these hypocritical and dangerous people. And that's when the idea of installing a hidden camera in the living room began to germinate in my mind. It was a risky decision, but I knew it was the only way to unmask their true faces. Deciding to install the hidden camera wasn't easy. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. There was the fear of what would happen if I were discovered. They certainly wouldn't leave me alone. My mother-in-law, with her harsh and authoritarian character, would be capable of anything to silence me. There was the disgust of having to investigate and witness for myself the dirty affairs happening under the same roof where I lived. And there was also a hint of guilt for having to resort to a not entirely honorable method, invading others' privacy. But all those doubts quickly dissipated. I remembered the indifferent and insensitive look on my husband Michael's face every time I tried to vent about the injustices I suffered. Every time my mother-in-law insulted me for no reason, he remained silent. Or worse, advised me to endure it to keep the peace in the house. I remembered the image of my mother-in-law hurling insults, treating me like an unpaid servant, and the image of my brother-in-law with his hypocritical smile and cunning words that always hid a calculation. All that eliminated any hesitation in me. I knew that if I didn't save myself, no one would. In this game, I had no allies but myself. I spent several nights searching online, meticulously researching types of hidden cameras. I needed to choose one that was not visible, but had good image quality. Finally, I chose a button-sized type that could be camouflaged as a coat hook. It had full HD quality, a clear recording microphone, and most importantly, Wi-Fi connectivity, allowing me to watch in real time from my phone anywhere. I used the little money I had saved from my emergency funds, money I had kept without Michael's knowledge for unforeseen events. That money was supposed to be for my parents who lived in the countryside, but now I had to use it to protect myself. The installation was also a problem. I had to choose a time when the whole family was out of the house. Fortunately, that weekend, the family went out of state to attend a distant relative's funeral. For me, it was a golden opportunity. On Saturday, I was alone in the house all day, my heart in my throat. I decided to install it in a high corner of the living room, camouflaged as a nail for hanging a landscape painting. From that position, I could see the entire living room, especially the sofa area where my mother-in-law and brother-in-law usually sat to talk. I struggled with it all afternoon, trembling, my heart pounding. Every time I heard a strange noise outside, every time a car passed, I jumped, fearing someone would suddenly return. Finally, after much effort, I finished the installation. I turned on my phone and connected it to the camera. The image was very clear, and the sound was decent. I let out a sigh of relief, but a heavy sense of anxiety settled in a corner of my heart. I had stepped into a world I never wanted to know. For the first few days, the camera caught nothing unusual. Life in the house went on as usual. My mother-in-law was still harsh with me. Michael was still indifferent, and my brother-in-law came by occasionally, still pretending to be the exemplary son-in-law in front of everyone. For a moment, I thought maybe I was really being paranoid. Maybe it was all a product of my imagination. But one Wednesday afternoon, while I was at the office, my phone vibrated with a notification. The camera had detected motion in the living room. I quickly opened the app to check. I felt my heart stop. On the screen were my mother-in-law and my brother-in-law, Mark, sitting on the sofa. At first, they were talking normally, but soon Mark began to behave intimately. He wrapped his arm around her waist and whispered something in her ear. My mother-in-law didn't resist at all. On the contrary, she rested her head on his shoulder with a satisfied smile. I felt nauseous and couldn't watch anymore. I turned off the phone, ran to the bathroom, and vomited violently. The truth was much more disgusting than I had imagined. But that wasn't all. In the following days, the camera recorded countless even more terrible scenes. They hugged and kissed on the same sofa where the whole family used to sit and watch television. They said words and made affectionate gestures that only lovers would. And the climax was one afternoon when neither Michael nor Laura was home. They had sex without reservation in the living room. I had to witness all of it through the screen of my phone, alone, in silence, and with absolute terror. I saved all those videos, made several copies, and stored them in a safe place. I knew this was my weapon, my only way out of this hell. But I didn't act yet. I waited for the opportunity, for the moment when the last straw would break the camel's back. I didn't want to be the one to start the war. I wanted them themselves to light the fire of their own collapse. And on that Christmas night, when Michael raised the belt and my mother-in-law shouted accusations at me, I knew my moment had come. Now that the truth had been revealed, the living room was no longer a warm and harmonious gathering place. It had become a courtroom where everyone had to face the judgment of their conscience, and I, the accused, had unintentionally become the judge. The television screen remained frozen on the most humiliating moment. The silence in the living room was now more terrifying than a scream. It was like the calm before the storm where everyone knew a terrible collapse was imminent, but no one could stop it. It was my mother-in-law, Carol, who first broke the silence, but not with words, but with an act of madness. Humiliation and fear had turned her into an irrational beast. She staggered, picked up an expensive porcelain vase from the table, and prepared to throw it at the television as if doing so could erase the evidence of her sin. I'm going to smash it. I'm going to kill you, you bitch. But before she could act, a hand firmly gripped her wrist. It was my sister-in-law, Laura. It was the first time in the 5 years I had been married that I saw her act with such determination. The submissive woman who lived under the shell of the perfect wife and mother no longer existed. Enough, Mother. How long are you going to make a fool of yourself in front of everyone? Her voice trembled, but was filled with rage. Tears still streamed down her cheeks, but in her eyes there was not only pain, but also hatred. She turned to the man standing beside her, stiff as a statue, her husband, whom she had loved and trusted blindly. You, Mark, how could this happen? You and my mother? Are you too? The pain choked her, and she couldn't finish the sentence. It was a question she probably never in her life wanted to ask. Mark seemed to wake from a dream. He hastily knelt before Laura, grabbing her legs and beginning to cry pathetically. Another act of his play had begun. Laura, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was forced by your mother. It's all her fault. She seduced me. I'm just a victim. His cowardly and shameless words left everyone stunned. Not even I, who knew him as a refined and courteous man, could have imagined he was capable of saying something so vile. To save himself, he was willing to blame his mother-in-law and lover entirely, trying to present himself as a poor victim, a weak man who couldn't resist the seduction of an older woman. Hearing this, Carol began to laugh like a mad woman. Her demented and pitiful laughter echoed in the room. A victim! You, a victim! Damn you! It was you again and again who came to me, seducing me with your sweet words. It was you who said your wife was always depressing and boring, that you only felt like a real man when you were with me, and now you try to blame me for everything. She shrieked, pointing directly at Mark's face. The fight between the two sinners turned the living room into a marketplace. They insulted each other, humiliated each other, and revealed the dirtiest secrets in front of all the relatives. It turned out their relationship wasn't a simple affair. There were also promises and calculations involved. Mark had used his mother-in-law to get favors at work, and Carol had found in her son-in-law the satisfaction her late husband never gave her. The incestuous drama had now become a farce of mutual accusations. Amid the chaos, my husband, Michael, finally reacted. He stood up and walked towards his mother, but he said nothing. He just looked at her with a strange, empty gaze, the look of a son who had completely lost faith in the mother he once idolized. Then he turned to me. His look was complex, a mixture of shame, regret, and something that looked like a plea. He opened his mouth. His voice was, "Sarah, But I didn't let him finish. I was too tired of late apologies and hypocritical regrets. I cut him off coldly. "What are you going to say? Ask for my forgiveness or say you didn't know anything? Michael, don't fool yourself. You're her son. You lived in this house. Did you really not notice anything strange? Or maybe you knew, but you chose silence because you're a coward with no courage to face the truth." My words were like the last blade in his bleeding heart. Michael staggered, unable to say anything more. He realized I had seen everything. His silence, his indifference were not carelessness. They were complicity. The fight continued with more fury. The relatives who were previously spectators now began to murmur. "My God, I can't believe it. What a scandal. The shame of the family. How are we going to face people now? Poor Sarah. How much she must have suffered these 5 years." The pendulum of public opinion had swung completely to my side. They no longer looked at me with contempt, but with compassion, and even a little respect. I was no longer alone. The family court was coming to an end, but the judgment of society was just beginning. And in this storm, there would be people who would pay a very high price for the sins they had committed. The heated argument between my mother-in-law and brother-in-law only stopped when the great-uncle, the oldest and most authoritative relative, couldn't take it anymore and slammed his fist on the table. "Enough. All of you. Be quiet. Turning the house into this pigsty on Christmas Eve in front of the memory of our ancestors. What a disgrace." His authoritative shout silenced everything for a moment. Carol and Mark stopped insulting each other, but still glared with eyes that shot sparks. The hatred for the one who had betrayed them was now greater than the humiliation. The room fell back into a suffocating silence, broken only by agitated breathing and Laura's sobs. The great-uncle was my husband's father's brother, a strict, moralistic man, respected by all. He had always been the one to mediate family matters, big and small. The great-uncle turned to me. In his gaze there was no longer scrutiny, but a mixture of apology and a little guilt. "Sarah, my child, I have no words for this. On behalf of the family, I apologize to you. You have suffered too many injustices." I nodded slightly without saying anything. That apology, though late, gave me a small comfort. It showed that in this family, there was still someone who knew right from wrong, that it wasn't just me who had seen their corruption and hypocrisy. The great-uncle turned back to Michael with a stern voice. "And you, Michael, as a husband and head of the family, how did you allow something so terrible to happen? Instead of protecting your wife, you acted recklessly and violently, almost committing a grave sin. Do you still consider yourself a man? Do you think your late father could rest in peace if he knew this?" Each of his words was an invisible whip that lashed Michael's conscience. He hung his head, his shoulders trembling. He couldn't refute a single word. Everything the great-uncle said was true. He was a failed husband, a bad son, and a coward. After a moment of silence, the great-uncle, in a last attempt to fix the situation, made a decision. "Well, at this point, we can't hide it anymore. Let's resolve this discreetly at home so we don't become a laughingstock. The matter of Carol and Mark will be punished accordingly by the family later. And as for your marriage, Michael, you must formally apologize to Sarah and treat her well from now on. You must not let her suffer any injustice again." The great-uncle's words were like a final sentence, an effort to save the family's remaining honor. Everyone thought it was a reasonable solution. They expected me to accept that apology, continue with this marriage, and that everything would be buried in silence, like so many other injustices that daughters-in-law often suffer. But they were wrong again, very wrong. I had been silent for 5 years. I had endured to the limit. If I had risen tonight, it was not to receive an apology or to continue a marriage that was already rotten. It was to reclaim my own freedom and dignity. I took a deep breath and looked directly at the great uncle. My voice was calm but firm. "Uncle, I appreciate your kind words, but I cannot accept this solution." A new murmur of astonishment filled the room. No one could believe I dared to contradict an elder's decision. This is no longer a family problem. It has crossed the lines of marriage. It has crossed the lines of human morality. I cannot continue to live in an environment of lies, deceit, and perversion. I want a divorce. The word divorce came out of my mouth lightly, but with the destructive power of a bomb. Michael's head shot up, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Sarah, what are you saying?" "No, please, I've been